He came home smelling like the jungle, 17 days without soap, feet blistered raw inside sandals cut from Vietnamese tires, a rifle hacked short with a garage hacksaw still strapped across his chest. He had spent 6 weeks inside enemy territory, moving at 100 meters per hour through triple canopy, so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. The Viet Cong called him, and the men like him, Ma Rung, Phantom of the Jungle, and they had standing orders never to engage him unless absolutely necessary. He had killed more enemy fighters in a single tour than most American platoons managed in a year, and when he stepped off the transport plane onto Australian soil, nobody was there to meet him. No parade, no handshake from a commanding officer, no journalist asking what he had seen. Instead, a customs official looked at his paperwork, looked at his face, and told him to move along. Within 6 months, he would discover that the Returned Servicemen's League, the very organization built to honor Australian veterans, did not want him as a member. Within a year, he would learn that speaking publicly about what he had done in Vietnam could result in criminal prosecution. Within a decade, he would understand that the government that sent him into those jungles had decided that the things he did there were better left buried. This is the story they never wanted told. Not because the Australian SAS failed in Vietnam, because they succeeded in ways that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. And when those men came home, carrying knowledge that contradicted official narratives, carrying memories that challenged institutional reputations, carrying truths that could embarrass governments on both sides of the Pacific, the response was not gratitude. It was silence, enforced, systematic, and deliberate silence. To understand why, you have to go back to what those men actually did in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province, and then you have to follow them home. Between 1966 and 1971, approximately 580 men served with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam. They were based at Nui Dat, on a small elevated feature that became known simply as SAS Hill. Their official designation was reconnaissance. Their actual function went far beyond anything that word typically describes. The 3 Sabre squadrons rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments, conducting what the regiment's own records classify as nearly 1,200 combat patrols. The New Zealand SAS contributed an additional 130 patrols, with Kiwi troops integrated directly into Australian squadrons from late 1968 onward. The numbers alone are remarkable. Over that 5-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS killed 492 confirmed enemy fighters, with 106 listed as possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 captured as prisoners. Their own losses were almost impossibly low. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. Those figures represent a kill ratio that no other Allied unit in Vietnam came close to matching. The Viet Cong knew it. Captured documents revealed that enemy commanders had issued specific guidance regarding the Australians that differed radically from their instructions for engaging American forces. Against Americans, the guidance emphasized aggression, ambush at carefully selected locations, inflict maximum casualties in the opening seconds, withdraw before artillery becomes effective. Against Australians, the guidance was something else entirely. Avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because the Australians were more likely to detect the trap before entering it. Do not attempt pursuit. If contact was unavoidable, break it off immediately and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The Viet Cong had a term for the Australian SAS that they applied to no other Western force: Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The term carried connotations beyond ordinary military respect. It suggested something almost supernatural. Soldiers who appeared from nowhere, killed without sound, and vanished before anyone understood what had happened. The fear was real enough to measure. Enemy activity in Phuoc Toi province, where the Australians concentrated their operations, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area flatly refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. The methods that produced this fear were methodical and deliberate. Australian SAS operators stopped using soap, deodorant, and commercial hygiene products weeks before a patrol. They ate indigenous food. They wore sandals cut from automobile tires, identical to standard Viet Cong footwear, so their tracks would be indistinguishable from enemy movement. They modified their weapons, shortening the barrels of their L1A1 self-loading rifles to eliminate snagging in dense vegetation. They moved at speeds that American observers initially dismissed as operationally absurd, sometimes covering only 100 meters in an hour. And they operated in 5-man patrols deep inside enemy territory for weeks at a time, gathering intelligence with a patience and precision that no technological system could replicate. The Aboriginal contribution to this methodology was not a footnote, it was foundational. Private trackers recruited through programs that the Australian government would deny existed for decades brought skills refined over 40 millennia of survival in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. These men could determine from a single footprint not just the direction of travel, but the approximate weight of the person who made it, whether they were carrying a load, whether they were injured, how long ago they had passed, and often whether they were alert or relaxed at the time. They could read broken vegetation the way literate people read books. They could detect human presence through absence, noticing when birds had stopped calling or insects had gone silent in patterns that indicated intrusion. One Aboriginal tracker reportedly identified 17 separate habitual paths used by Viet Cong personnel moving between cave complexes in the Long High Mountains. Like animal trails in the Australian bush, these runs represented the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of movements, the paths of least resistance through dense vegetation, and like any hunter who understands the habits of his prey, the tracker knew that the best place to wait was along these runs. The integration of this indigenous knowledge into a Western military framework was unprecedented. No other Allied force attempted anything comparable, and the results were undeniable. Intelligence capabilities that no electronic sensor, no infrared camera, no satellite photograph could replicate. American Navy SEAL veteran Roger Hayden, who spent 10 days operating alongside Australian SAS in Vietnam, later said he learned more about reconnaissance during that period than in any training program he had ever attended. The Australians did not speak a single word for the entire 10 days. They communicated entirely through hand and arm signals, touches, and movements so subtle that Hayden admitted he missed half of them. This was the reality of what those men did, and when they came home, almost none of them were permitted to talk about it. The silence began before the veterans even left the military. The nature of SAS operations in Vietnam was classified from the start. The regiment operated under security protocols that restricted what its members could discuss, with whom, and in what detail. After-action reports were filed at high classification levels. Operational methods, the scent discipline, the movement techniques, the weapons modifications, the psychological operations were considered sensitive military information. Men who had spent years perfecting these techniques were told in no uncertain terms that discussing them publicly could constitute a breach of Australian law. The SAS selection process itself created men who were psychologically predisposed to accept such restrictions. Candidates were assessed for a specific personality profile: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what military psychologists termed predatory patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training program lasting 18 months, 3 times longer than American Special Forces training of the same era. A significant portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been committed to writing. These were men trained from the beginning to keep secrets. The military had selected them for their capacity to endure isolation. It had trained them to operate for weeks without speaking a word. It had forged them into instruments of precise, silent violence. And then, when the violence was done, it turned those same qualities against them. The capacity for silence that made them lethal in the jungle made them compliant in the face of classification. The low need for social validation that made them effective operators made them unlikely to seek public recognition. The independence that sustained them behind enemy lines made them capable of enduring decades of isolation from the broader veteran community. The military had built perfect soldiers and, by the same design, perfect keepers of secrets. Australia's Crimes Act contained provisions, originally modeled on the British Official Secrets Act, that criminalized the unauthorized disclosure of government information. Part 7 of the Crimes Act 1914, titled Official Secrets and Unlawful Soundings, gave the government broad power to prosecute anyone who revealed information obtained through their government service. For SAS veterans, this meant that the very experiences that defined them, that had transformed them from ordinary Australians into something the enemy called phantoms, were legally off-limits for public discussion. But the legal restrictions were only the first layer. The institutional silence went deeper, and it came from directions that the veterans never expected. The Returned and Services League of Australia, the RSL, was the beating heart of Australian veteran culture. Founded in 1916 during the catastrophe of the First World War, it had grown into one of the most powerful social institutions in the country. For generations, returning Australian soldiers had found community, support, and recognition through their local RSL sub-branch. The RSL ran the Anzac Day marches. The RSL maintained the memorials. The RSL was where veterans went to be among men who understood what they had been through. And when the Vietnam veterans came home, many RSL branches shut them out. The men who had fought at Gallipoli and in the deserts of North Africa and through the jungles of New Guinea looked at the Vietnam returnees and decided they were not worthy of the same recognition. Vietnam was not a real war, some of them said. It was a police action, a sideshow to the Americans, the veterans who had achieved the highest kill ratio of any Allied unit in the conflict, who had earned the grudging terror of a hardened guerrilla enemy, who had operated for weeks behind enemy lines using techniques refined over 40,000 years of indigenous Australian knowledge. These men were told by their own countrymen that what they did not count. For SAS veterans, the sting was particularly acute. They could not explain what they had done because their operations were classified. They could not point to their achievements because the records were sealed. They could not describe their methods because the methods were considered sensitive. All they could say was that they had served, and the response from the very institution designed to honor that service was dismissal. Some RSL branches, particularly in rural areas, were welcoming, but the pattern of exclusion was widespread enough that it left scars that decades have not fully healed. Vietnam veterans were excluded from marching in Anzac Day parades during the 1970s. Soldiers from earlier wars saw them as unworthy heirs to the Anzac tradition. For men who had endured things that would have broken most human beings, this rejection from their own veteran community was devastating. But the RSL rejection was personal. What came from the broader Australian public was political, and it was fueled by forces that had nothing to do with what the SAS had actually accomplished. By the late 1960s, Australian society was in the grip of the same anti-war convulsion that was tearing America apart. The introduction of conscription in 1964, requiring 20-year-old men to register for national service, with those selected by a birthday lottery potentially sent to Vietnam, had fractured the social contract. Televised images of the war's destruction entered Australian living rooms nightly. The moratorium marches of 1970 drew hundreds of thousands of protesters into the streets of Melbourne, Sydney, and other cities. Public opinion shifted decisively against the conflict. Returning veterans found themselves caught in the crossfire between a government that had sent them and a public that increasingly viewed the war as unjust. Some veterans reported being called murderers, baby killers, or worse. The public made no distinction between the methods of the Australian military and those of the Americans. Images of napalm strikes, Agent Orange defoliation, and the massacre at My Lai were seared into the collective consciousness. Australians were painted with the same brush, despite the fact that Australian forces in Vietnam operated under fundamentally different tactical doctrines and achieved fundamentally different results. For SAS veterans, this was a particularly bitter irony. Their methods had been the opposite of the heavy-handed American approach that generated so much of the war's worst imagery. They had operated with surgical precision in tiny teams, using techniques designed to minimize collateral damage. Their approach was to become invisible, to gather intelligence without firing a shot when possible, to strike with devastating accuracy when necessary, and disappear before the enemy could respond. But they could not explain any of this. The operations were classified, the methods were restricted, the results were buried in reports that would not be declassified for decades. And so, the men who had perhaps the strongest case for having fought with discipline and professionalism were denied the ability to make that case at all. The silence was not just painful, it was strategically enforced. And then came the chemicals. Beyond the combat itself, beyond the social rejection and the classified silence, Australian Vietnam veterans faced another battle that would consume decades: the fight to have their government acknowledge what Agent Orange had done to their bodies. During the war, some 66 million liters of herbicides had been sprayed over South Vietnam. with a significant portion falling over the Australian area of operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. Every soldier who served there had potential exposure to the toxic chemical cocktail, which contained the highly dangerous compound 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, commonly known as TCDD. Veterans began reporting alarming health problems in the late 1970s: cancers, neurological conditions, birth defects in their children. In 1979, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia formally claimed that Agent Orange exposure was responsible. The government's response was to establish a royal commission in 1983, led by Justice Philip Evatt. The VAA fought against bitter opposition, but the resources were grotesquely uneven. The Australian government and chemical company Monsanto helped fund the legal defense against the veterans' claims. By 1985, the VVAA had exhausted its funds for legal representation. Veteran Phil Thompson, who had become the public face of the campaign, was forced to represent the association himself before the commission. He spoke of the great imbalance of resources available to the veterans who were seeking nothing more than recognition that their service had poisoned them. The Evatt Commission's final report, published in August 1985, rejected the veterans' central claims. It found no definitive link between chemical defoliant exposure and the health problems veterans were reporting. The finding was devastating. It told men who were watching their bodies deteriorate, who were burying children born with unexplained defects, that the government's official position was that their suffering had nothing to do with their service. Phil Thompson, who had spent years fighting for recognition, died in 1986. The controversy did not die with him. It persisted for nearly another decade until 1994, when the Keating government finally acknowledged a link between Agent Orange and cancer, prompted in part by American research that had reached conclusions the Australian Royal Commission had refused to accept. The Agent Orange fight exemplified the pattern perfectly. Veterans spoke up about what had been done to them. The government deployed legal and institutional resources to silence those claims. Years of suffering elapsed before truth was acknowledged, and by the time acknowledgment came, many of the men who needed it most were already in the ground. Because here is the truth that made the silence necessary. What the Australian SAS accomplished in Vietnam did not merely demonstrate Australian excellence. It demonstrated American failure. And both governments had powerful reasons for keeping that comparison out of the public conversation. The Australian SAS kill ratio in Phuoc Tuy Province reached levels that the American military command structure found difficult to process. The overall MICV average hovered around 7-1. Conventional American infantry averaged roughly 1-1. The Australians, in the same war, against the same enemy, in the same jungle, were achieving ratios that made American methods look not just inferior, but catastrophically flawed. The reasons were documented. American intelligence officers visited the Australian base, observed their methods, and wrote detailed reports recommending that American units adopt Australian techniques. Those reports were filed, stamped, and buried. The Pentagon was not interested in lessons that suggested its fundamental doctrines were producing failure. American military culture was built on speed, aggression, and overwhelming firepower. The idea that patience might outperform aggression, that stillness might outperform movement, that 5 men moving silently could accomplish what 100 men with helicopter gunships could not. These concepts were philosophically alien to an institution built on different assumptions. Publicly acknowledging Australian superiority would have required acknowledging American institutional failure. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about why techniques that were available for learning in 1966 were not adopted until decades later. It would have demanded an accounting of how many American casualties might have been prevented if institutional pride had not prevented institutional learning. Neither the Australian government nor the American government wanted those questions asked. Australia depended on the American alliance for its broader strategic security. Embarrassing the Americans by publicizing just how much better Australian methods performed was not in Canberra's interest, and Washington had no intention of amplifying a story that made its military establishment look incompetent. So, the comparison was suppressed. The Australian methods remained classified. The men who had pioneered those methods were told to keep quiet, and the institutional failure that cost American lives continued unchallenged for years. The silence had another dimension that was even more uncomfortable. Some of what the Australian SAS did in Vietnam occupied moral and legal territory that no government wanted examined too closely. The psychological warfare operations that had been so devastatingly effective against the Viet Cong, the staged body displays, the calling cards left on eliminated enemy fighters, the midnight infiltrations of enemy camps where signs of presence were left without engaging. These techniques existed in the classified annexes of after-action reports, in the whispered conversations of men who had witnessed them, and in the nightmares of Viet Cong soldiers who survived encounters with the Ma Rung. They worked. There is no question that they worked. The psychological degradation of enemy units in areas where Australian SAS operated was measurable and documented. Desertion rates spiked. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Unit cohesion collapsed. Commanders issued orders that subordinates were too frightened to execute. But these methods looked problematic under peacetime scrutiny. When classified assessments finally noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely have violated standing MACV directives if conducted by American personnel, the implications were clear. Publishing what the Australians had done would have invited questions about legality, about morality, about whether the ends justified the means. The Australian government had no interest in defending those methods in public. The American government had no interest in explaining why its most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by operating outside the constraints that governed American forces. And so both governments chose the same solution: silence, classification, the quiet burial of inconvenient truths. The veterans who carried these experiences understood intuitively what was happening. They had been used as instruments of state policy in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They had performed with extraordinary effectiveness, and now that effectiveness had become an embarrassment to American allies who had failed where Australians succeeded, to Australian politicians who did not want to defend controversial methods, to military institutions that preferred comfortable failure to uncomfortable success. The message was clear, even when it was never stated explicitly. What you did was valuable. What you know is dangerous. Keep your mouth shut. The psychological cost of this enforced silence compounded the psychological damage of the war itself. The transformation required to become what the jungle demanded: the state of pure sensory awareness, the suppression of normal human thought patterns, the capacity to exist for weeks as something closer to a predatory animal than a conventional soldier. These adaptations did not simply reverse themselves when the patrol ended. Studies of Australian Vietnam veterans found PTSD prevalence rates between 20 and 30%. Combat exposure increased the risk of a range of conditions: heart disease, circulatory problems, alcohol use disorders, and other psychiatric conditions. But for SAS veterans specifically, the psychological profile was more complex. They had trained themselves to eliminate the internal noise that defines normal human consciousness: the plans, the anxieties, the memories, the anticipations that shape everyday behavior. They had learned to perceive without interpreting, to observe without planning, to respond without deliberating. This state made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone could not achieve. It also made returning to civilian life extraordinarily difficult. Veterans reported inability to tolerate the noise and chaos of normal environments, hypervigilance that persisted for years and decades after service, struggles with relationships because the emotional openness that human connection requires was precisely what they had trained themselves to suppress. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily rejoin the herd. And when they sought help, when they tried to process what they had experienced, they ran into the wall of classification. They could not discuss their operations with civilian therapists who lacked security clearances. They could not share the specifics of what haunted them because those specifics were legally restricted. They were expected to recover from experiences they were forbidden to describe. The Viet Cong had called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, neither fully present in one realm nor able to return to another. The Australian SAS veterans who mastered jungle warfare found themselves similarly suspended, not fully present in the civilian world they returned to, not able to forget the jungle world they had inhabited. Some never found their way back completely. It took 15 years before Australia began to acknowledge what it had done to its Vietnam veterans. In 1987, a Welcome Home parade was organized in Sydney. 25,000 veterans marched through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of people. Men who had not spoken to each other since leaving Vietnam found themselves face to face for the first time in over a decade. Some recognized each other immediately: the way a man holds his shoulders, the way he scans a crowd. These are things that soldiers who have shared jungle darkness never forget. Others had changed beyond recognition, aged and weathered by years of carrying burdens that nobody around them understood. There were men in wheelchairs, men walking with prosthetic limbs, men whose bodies bore the visible scars of wounds sustained in firefights that their government had classified and their neighbors had never heard of. And there were men who looked physically whole, but whose eyes carried a distance that anyone who has known combat veterans would recognize immediately: the look of someone who is present in body, but has left some essential part of themselves in a place they can never fully leave. For many, it was the first time since returning from the war that they felt their country recognized their service. Some wept openly. Grown men who had maintained iron composure under enemy fire, who had lain motionless for hours while Viet Cong patrols passed within arm's reach, who had suppressed every natural human impulse in the service of survival. These men stood on the streets of Sydney and let themselves feel something they had denied themselves for 15 years. The crowds cheered. Strangers reached out to shake hands, to say thank you, to offer the simple human acknowledgement that had been withheld for so long. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough to compensate for 15 years of rejection. But it was something. It was a beginning. 5 years later, in 1992, the Vietnam Forces National Memorial was dedicated on Anzac Parade in Canberra. These gestures mattered. They represented a turning point in public attitudes, but they could not undo the damage of 15 years of rejection, classification, and silence, and they did not address the fundamental problem that still hangs over the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam. The story has never been fully told. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations was not completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed Vietnam. Classified top secret, distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, it reached conclusions that contradicted everything American military doctrine had assumed about counterinsurgency warfare. Small unit operations by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations with overwhelming firepower. Indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technology could replicate. Psychological operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects vastly disproportionate to resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep-and-clear operation. These conclusions were revolutionary. They anticipated by decades the reforms that would eventually reshape American special operations. When the United States military finally undertook serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the principles it adopted were ones that Australians had demonstrated effective 20 years earlier. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire apparatus of modern American unconventional warfare, all of it incorporates lessons that were available for learning in 1967. The methods were there. The evidence was overwhelming. The Australians were willing to teach. The institutions were not willing to learn. And the men who could have taught those lessons were forbidden from speaking. The pattern of silencing Australian military truth-tellers did not end with Vietnam. It evolved, hardened, and became embedded in law. Australia's secrecy apparatus has expanded dramatically in the decades since, creating a legal framework that makes the Vietnam-era restrictions look almost quaint by comparison. The old Crimes Act provisions were eventually replaced by Part 5.6 of the Criminal Code Act, 1995, which broadened the definition of what could be classified and stiffened the penalties for unauthorized disclosure. The Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Act of 2024 went further still, requiring former military personnel to obtain a foreign work authorization before sharing military knowledge with foreign entities. The maximum penalty for breach, 20 years imprisonment. These laws are not abstractions. In 2024, former military lawyer David McBride was sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in prison for leaking classified documents that revealed evidence of war crimes committed by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. The documents he disclosed led to the ABC's Afghan Files series, which detailed allegations of unlawful killings by SAS members. Those allegations were later substantiated by the Brereton Report, a 4-year government inquiry that found credible evidence of 39 unlawful killings by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan between 2005 and 2016. The first person imprisoned in connection with those war crimes was not one of the soldiers who allegedly committed them. It was the whistleblower who exposed them. The human rights lawyer who represented victims' families observed that this outcome sent a clear message about what the Australian government valued more: accountability or secrecy. The parallels to the Vietnam era are unmistakable. In both conflicts, Australian Special Forces demonstrated extraordinary capability. In both conflicts, aspects of their conduct raised questions that institutional power preferred to suppress. In both conflicts, the men who carried inconvenient truths were told, through classification, through legal threat, through social exclusion, to keep silent. The Brereton Report itself, released in November 2020 after 4 years of investigation, described a culture within the SAS that had metastasized in the decades between Vietnam and Afghanistan. It found that junior soldiers were required by patrol commanders to murder prisoners as a form of initiation, a practice known as blooding. Weapons and other material were planted near bodies of civilians to suggest they had been lawfully killed. The patrol commanders who conceived, committed, and concealed these acts occupied the same non-commissioned ranks, corporals and sergeants, who had once been the backbone of the regiment's legendary Vietnam-era performance. Something had gone wrong between the jungles of Phuoc Tuy and the mountains of Uruzgan. The culture of silence that had originally been imposed to protect legitimate operational secrets had evolved into something darker, a culture that protected criminality under the guise of protecting national security. The very secrecy mechanisms that had kept Vietnam-era SAS methods classified for decades provided the institutional framework within which newer, far more disturbing conduct could be concealed. Former SAS Captain Andrew Hastie, who later became a member of Parliament and chair of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, admitted publicly that he had knowledge of similar incidents during his own service in Afghanistan. He described a warrior ethos within the regiment that had become something unrecognizable, one built on power, ego, and self-adulation that was the opposite of the humility he had expected to find. The institutional response to these revelations followed the same script that Vietnam veterans would have recognized. When a former Army intelligence officer who provided evidence to the Brereton inquiry had her home attacked in November 2020, the New South Wales Police could not identify the perpetrators. When investigators and journalists pushed for accountability, they encountered a system designed to resist transparency at every level. When the public demanded answers, the government deployed classification and national security arguments to limit what could be revealed. The cycle of silence: use elite soldiers, benefit from their capabilities, refuse to confront what those capabilities actually entailed, punish anyone who tries to break the silence, had repeated itself across half a century. There is a deeper pattern here that stretches across decades and conflicts, one that connects the jungles of Phuoc Tuy to the mountains of Uruzgan, one that links the men who wore Ho Chi Minh sandals through Vietnamese undergrowth to the men who kicked in doors in Afghan villages. It is the pattern of a nation that asks extraordinary things of its soldiers and then finds itself unable to confront what those extraordinary things actually entailed. The SAS veterans of Vietnam carried knowledge that was genuinely dangerous, not because it threatened national security in any meaningful sense, but because it threatened institutional narratives. It threatened the story that American military doctrine was the gold standard. It threatened the story that Australia's role in Vietnam was a minor supporting act to the American main event. It threatened the story that the war was fought within neat legal and moral boundaries. The response was not to confront those threats honestly. It was to classify, to restrict, to silence, to wait for the men who carried the inconvenient truths to grow old enough that their stories would die with them. Some of those stories have been recovered through veteran memoirs, through declassified documents that have emerged decades after the fact, through academic research that pieced together fragments from archives around the world. But vast portions of the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam remain locked in classified vaults, accessible only to researchers with security clearances and the patience to navigate a bureaucratic system that was designed to obstruct rather than illuminate. The 580 men who served with the Australian SAS in Vietnam are aging now. The youngest of them are in their mid-70s. Many have already passed on, taking their stories with them. The ones who remain carry knowledge that belongs not just to them, but to their nation. Knowledge about what works and what fails in unconventional warfare, about the true cost of asking human beings to transform themselves into instruments of state violence, about what happens when governments prioritize institutional comfort over honest reckoning. In the early 1990s, some Australian Vietnam veterans began making pilgrimages back to Vietnam. They returned to places where they had lost friends, where they had taken lives, where they had been fundamentally and permanently changed. Some met former enemy soldiers and discovered that the men on the other side of those ambushes carried the same haunted expressions, the same inability to fully explain what they had experienced, the same sense of being forever caught between the world of the war and the world of peace. The Vietnamese understood. They had their own ghosts. What the Vietnamese did not understand, what still confuses historians who study the Australian experience, is why a nation would send its most capable soldiers into the most demanding combat of an entire war, benefit from their extraordinary performance, and then systematically deny them the right to speak about what they had done. The answer is that silence was never about protecting the veterans. It was about protecting the institutions that sent them, the military that did not want its classified methods discussed publicly, the government that did not want its alliance with America complicated by unflattering comparisons, the intelligence apparatus that did not want its operational techniques examined in open forums, the political establishment that did not want to defend controversial methods to an increasingly skeptical public. The veterans were the expendable element in this calculation. They could be classified into silence. They could be excluded from veteran organizations. They could be denied the therapeutic benefit of telling their own stories. They could be left to metabolize their experiences alone, in the dark, without the support structures that honest acknowledgement would have provided. And that is precisely what happened when the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia was formed in 1980, partly as a crisis counseling service and partly as a vehicle for pursuing recognition of Agent Orange exposure claims. It represented something more than an advocacy organization. It represented a refusal to accept the silence. The men who built the VVAA were saying, in effect, that the government's preferred narrative, the one where Vietnam was a quiet chapter best left unread, was not acceptable. They fought for recognition of herbicide exposure, battling a royal commission established in 1983 that ultimately rejected their claims in a finding that remained bitterly contested for years. They fought for the Welcome Home Parade that finally came in 1987. They fought for the National Memorial that was dedicated in 1992. They fought for basic respect from an RSL that had treated them as second-class veterans for over a decade. Each of these fights was a fight against silence. Each victory was a crack in the wall that had been built around their experience. But the wall was thick, and the cracks were slow to spread. Today, Special Operations Forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam as foundational doctrine. The tracker programs, the psychological operations methodology, the long-range patrol techniques, the emphasis on environmental integration over technological dominance, all of it has been incorporated into modern training curricula at Fort Liberty and Coronado and Special Forces schools across a dozen countries. What was once classified as too controversial to acknowledge has become required reading. Yet something has been lost in the translation. Modern special operations can replicate Australian tactics. They struggle to replicate Australian psychology, the transformation that turns sheep farmers and factory workers into jungle phantoms, the willingness to become something other than a conventional soldier, the acceptance that effective hunting requires becoming a hunter not merely in your training, but in your soul. That transformation was the product of a specific military culture, refined through a century of colonial warfare, frontier survival, and collaboration with Aboriginal Australians, whose tracking knowledge represented 40,000 years of accumulated expertise. It cannot be learned from a manual. It cannot be acquired in a 6-month course. It was, and remains, something that emerged from a particular people, a particular landscape, and a particular tradition of adapting to environments that could not be conquered through force alone. The men who carried that tradition into the jungles of Vietnam deserve more than belated parades and posthumous recognitions. They deserve the right to have their full story told, not the sanitized version that governments prefer, not the classified fragments that researchers can pry from reluctant archives, but the complete account of what they did, why they did it, how it worked, and what it cost them. They didn't want us talking. That was the message delivered through classification stamps and security briefings and legal threats and social exclusion. They didn't want us talking because what we had to say was inconvenient, because our success made other people's failure impossible to ignore, because our methods raised questions that nobody wanted to answer, because our experiences challenged narratives that powerful institutions had invested heavily in maintaining. 580 men, nearly 1,200 patrols, the highest kill ratio of the entire Vietnam War, and for decades their reward was silence. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods primitive. The RSL called their war illegitimate. Their own government called their experiences classified. The veterans who survived it all call it something simpler. They call it the truth. And the truth, no matter how deeply you bury it, no matter how many classification stamps you press onto it, no matter how many laws you write to contain it, has a way of finding its way to the surface. It just takes longer than it should. It always takes longer than it should. Martin Hamilton Smith, who served in the Australian SAS regiment from 1978 to 1982, and later became national chairman of the SAS Association, observed in 2024 that the pattern of mistreating veterans had repeated itself with eerie precision from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Vietnam veterans who were treated miserably by their government on their return from that unpopular conflict watched as a new generation of Special Forces soldiers faced the same institutional abandonment. The young men and women of today's Australian Defence Force were watching too. They had read the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, which revealed that veteran suicide rates had reached tragic levels due to poor treatment by government, particularly by the military justice system. ADF recruiting and retention had fallen to historic lows. The cycle of silence was producing consequences that extended far beyond the veterans themselves. It was eroding the very institution that depended on young Australians being willing to serve. Why would they join when the evidence of half a century showed that service would be rewarded first with silence, then with neglect, and finally with the hollow gestures of belated recognition that came only after the political cost of continued denial exceeded the political cost of acknowledgement? The SAS veterans of Vietnam understood this arithmetic long before anyone in Canberra did. They understood it in 1970, when they stepped off transport planes to empty tarmacs. They understood it in 1975, when the RSL told them their war was not real enough to merit membership. They understood it in 1985, when the Royal Commission told them their cancers had nothing to do with the chemicals their government had allowed to be sprayed over their heads. They understood it in 1987, when the Welcome Home Parade finally came. 15 years late, but better late than never, or so they were told by politicians who had done nothing to prevent the delay. They understood it in 2020, when the Brereton report revealed that the culture of secrecy they had been forced to maintain had metastasized into something that shielded not just legitimate operational methods, but actual war crimes. And they understood it in 2024, when the first person imprisoned in connection with Australian military misconduct turned out to be the whistleblower, not the accused. 521 Australians died in Vietnam. 60,000 served. The SAS lost 6 men killed and 28 wounded across 5 years of the most intense special operations combat of the entire conflict. And when the survivors came home, their country asked them to pretend that none of it had happened. They didn't want us talking. That was the message delivered through classification stamps and security briefings and legal threats and social exclusion. They didn't want us talking because what we had to say was inconvenient, because our success made other people's failure impossible to ignore, because our methods raised questions that nobody wanted to answer, because our experiences challenged narratives that powerful institutions had invested heavily in maintaining. 580 men, nearly 1,200 patrols, the highest kill ratio of the entire Vietnam War. And for decades, their reward was silence. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods primitive. The RSL called their war illegitimate. Their own government called their experiences classified. The veterans who survived it all call it something simpler. They call it the truth. And the truth, no matter how deeply you bury it, no matter how many classification stamps you press onto it, no matter how many laws you write to contain it, has a way of finding its way to the surface. It just takes longer than it should. It always takes longer than it should. They didn't want us talking, but we're talking now, and it's about time someone listened.